Welcome to another episode of I Didn't Know That About My Hometown History. Hey everybody, so welcome to the first episode finally of I Didn't Know That About My Hometown History. This sort of came about, this series. I had done a historical marker in Columbia, Pennsylvania, and it had talked about uh, Wrightsville being, or Wrights Ferry was what his original name was, and how there had, in my research, there was this conflict known as Cresap's War that happened because of the closeness of the ferries, but it was a much larger story than that. And sort of like there had been this conflict between Pennsylvania and Maryland, uh, dealing with what ultimately would lead to what we're talking about today is the Mason Dixon Line and its need to be done. I think it's very easy with history. A viewer had brought up, I didn't know that about the history and stuff like that. And it was just sort of, I was like, that would make a really good series. There's so much more to something that seems so simple. When you think of the Mason Dixon Line, at its simplest form, it's nothing more than the southern boundary of Pennsylvania, northern boundary line of Maryland. Um, Also, it became more into renown when you talked about the Mason-Dixon line, which it didn't exactly follow that line of Pennsylvania, but it sort of went along certain rivers, and anything that was north of that Mason-Dixon line were free states. Anything south of that were slave. Delaware sort of falls into that category of um, they were still a slave state, and there's some confusion with New Jersey as well about the abolishment of slavery. Now, I think slavery in New Jersey was gone by the late 40s, 1840s, but the abolishment thereof until the Emancipation Proclamation, it was still technically legal. But this Mason Dixon line, it is a much more complicated, and in putting this video together, a lot of research, the lines of latitude which they're supposed to be based upon are really, really confusing. And we're going to go through what sort of led to that conflict, what led to after certain resolutions, if you will, um, what they determine would be the actual line. And also some of this we've talked about a number of times with maps back then. Until those areas were truly surveyed, people really did not know where you say, oh, it's the 40th and the 39th parallels and stuff like that. There's no lines on actual land to know where those lines are. So both colonies are going to claim as much as they can. I mean, as an example, weirdly with Pennsylvania, the state of Connecticut, which used to love, or was a colony of Connecticut, used to love to claim land everywhere. So they actually claimed like the northern third of Pennsylvania, of what we know today as Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had claimed up this weird western part of New York, southern New York. They had claimed that. Virginia had claimed the southeast corner of what we know today as Pennsylvania. Um, Pennsylvania had actually claimed most of Maryland, probably down as low as the 38th parallel or lower. So there's very nothing left of Maryland if they would have had their claim. And Maryland claimed up into Pennsylvania up to the 40th parallel, which is probably the only correct claim in reality, because the original claim, as we'll go into, gave them up to there. And it was just because of the poor maps, the quality of really knowing where your lines actually were. A lot of states, like we'll use New Jersey as an example. Bob and I were talking about this. New Jersey had, of course, the shoreline, and then they had the Delaware River on the western side, which is, between them and Pennsylvania. So a lot of those, Maryland, for instance, the Potomac River is the southern border of the state. So those types of geographical features made state lines easy to determine. But when you had these straight lines on the states, they could be a little harder to distinguish. And when you had different gifting of the land by two separate kings, there was bound to be confusion, and there was 50 years separated between the two, as we'll talk about, and it made a mess. So let us go into this. So come along, and we're going to start talking a little bit more about the Mason Dixon line. In this first episode, I didn't know that about my hometown history. So our story begins in the reign of King Charles I. In 1632, he wound out giving land to a Cecil Calvert, and he originally said it would go up to the 40th degree parallel line, and then the southern border would be basically the Potomac River. Um, this was quite a big area and would unfortunately wind up being quite an issue. They were the lords of Baltimore, so therefore the capital of this new colony would be called Baltimore, and the Calverts decided to name this in honor of Queen Mary, I believe it was, and call it Maryland. The one thing important of note as well is that the Calverts were Catholic. This would wind out playing a role as well um, in the future with the conflict of with Pennsylvania, who were more religiously free, but also were primarily Protestants. So there was weirdly a little bit of a conflict as well in that regard. But there was just uh, where the original line would have been drawn was actually going to be north of what would eventually become Philadelphia. So Maryland actually had out of Pennsylvania and the colony of Maryland, they actually had the right to be slightly irritated by what would happen here in the future. And both sides would sort of try to claim between this 39th parallel and the 40th parallel. And everybody that was sort of stuck in between there, more out toward the central area, because they didn't try to do anything over towards Philadelphia or Delaware, even though they had made a claim of what would become the state of Delaware, the colony of Delaware, those three counties. Um, it just it this was bound to become an issue, and this would lead to what we will talk about here in a little bit. So, as you can see, we have the beginnings of the potential for a disaster. And as we see, there is a long length of time between the formation of the Maryland colony and then eventually the Pennsylvania colony. And because of that, because of the poor maps, because of really poor verbiage, and not a real lack of understanding of what they were trying to go for, sort of lost in translation, would eventually lead to what would become this coming conflict and the need for the Mason Dixon line. So Charles II, he would actually wind out being the one that would grant the land permits for William Penn. And this was, in essence, this was done. William Penn had already tried to start several Quaker colonies in New Jersey about religious freedom. There was, Church of England, Protestant churches, Catholic churches. None of them really got along in the old world. So William Penn's dream was to create something in the new world where religious freedom truly would happen. And in 1681, Charles II wound out granting 45,000 acres to William Penn to sort of pay off a debt to Admiral William Penn, who was William Penn's father. He had loaned a great deal to the throne, and they had no way of paying it off, so he did the land grant. Now, originally, William Penn was going to call his colony Sylvania, but then ultimately, in honor of his father, decided to call it Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods, in honor of the wooded land that he would be given. Now, he was told in his grant that he could have to below the 40th parallel, which was in conflict, unfortunately, of the grant to Maryland, which was given up to the 40th parallel. Now, one of the northern border was very, very easy with New York. I believe that was the 45th parallel. The eastern border was the Delaware River, and the western, there was really not a defined western border for a lot of these colonies. It just sort of went into oblivion. Um, but he was, they were told
that the southern border below the 40th parallel should go down to the northernmost tip of the Delaware Bay, which was about, I think, 15 miles south of Philadelphia. It might be more, but they said something about the town of Newcastle. It was just all very confusing of what was what. So Pennsylvania, of course, they declared much lower the line. Maryland had already been told the 40th parallel. So this was obviously going to create a lot of confusion. Maryland was also interested in having it to the 40th parallel because of Philadelphia was this great jewel of a city. And of course, Pennsylvania didn't want to give that up. So this was certainly ripe for a conflict. And needless to say, almost from the get go, there were issues of people just not knowing where the land and the line would actually be. It was just very, we can understand it today, I think, because we can look at certain things on an overall map that's finished, uh, properly surveyed, the dimensions are all correct. We can see exactly what they meant. But at that period of time, they didn't have the same things that we have today with maps and such. So we can easily discern, whereas it was not easy for them to discern at all, and ultimately led to this conflict that would start with the turning over of the new century.
So now we have the table set. We have this dysfunction of not knowing where the line actually is. We have Pennsylvania's claim, this is to the south, Maryland's claim, which is to the north to the original 40th parallel. Whether Delaware, these counties were actually ever part of that deal or not, it's sort of iffy. Certainly mistakes were made, and this would lead to what we know today as Cresap's War, named after Thomas Cresap's, who was an agent of the Lord Baltimore, Lord Calvert of Baltimore and Maryland, and he basically set him on a path that would start this war. There was fault clearly on both sides, but they could not come to an agreement during that period of time between 1681 and roughly around 1730. You have another 50 years of the Penns and even the king and the parliament saying the colony of Pennsylvania and the colony of Maryland need to get together and resolve this issue, and they just never could come to a resolution. They couldn't get along. They just, their ways of negotiating were very different, and there were a lot of different other areas of conflict, which would ultimately lead to Thomas Cresap's taking that directive and then going in to these areas that they considered theirs and harassing people, certainly being violent. I had said several times before that this was, from what I had read originally before I got into a lot more depth, there were no deaths. There actually was one death. This is not slapping. They actually had like large groups of military. Both militias for each colony has got involved. I think the first one there was like 20 militia from Maryland, and they just went around and just tormented these different farms that were in this York County region. And it was brutal. Like they shot livestock, they tormented people. He would sell land to people, and then his agents would go forth and say, Thomas Cresap's owns this land. You need to get off the land, even though they had paid Cresap's and Maryland for it. So, yeah, like with any time, you have a lot of skullduggery. You have people that are taking advantage of cheating, stealing, and those types of things. It's going on throughout the history of mankind, and this certainly was part of it. So the Pennsylvania colonists, they had a right to gripe because even though technically the 40th parallel was north of them, they also felt like they were Pennsylvania colonists. And even though Thomas Cresap settled in what was Pennsylvania, he was a loyal Maryland through and through and loyal to the Calvert family. And This would lead to what we know as Cressup's War.
So after 50 years of negotiating going nowhere, um, as early as 1724-26, John Wright, he wound out settling in what would become Columbia today. And he would start a small ferry, which they did not apply for a ferry license, which you had to do because the traffic finally met what they would need until about 1730. And at that stage, there was so much traffic, so many people moving there because of the ferry. Lord Calvert of Baltimore started to get quite concerned, and he hired Thomas Cressups, who you see here, to become his agent, to start a ferry just a little south of there to compete, and then also start taking back land. So this is the area you can see where there's a formation of where the area of conflict is. This is present day York County. Wright's Ferry would be the center of starting this. 4 miles to the south, Thomas Cressups would start a ferry of his own at Blue Rock. I believe it's now Washington Borough. But these ferries were basically general stores, trading posts. They were like their own little civil center, and you didn't usually put them within 25 miles. It'd be maybe a little less, a little more, depending on where you could actually do a crossing on a major waterway. But you just didn't do that. You didn't go within that small amount of mileage because, in essence, you would cancel each other out. You only had so many customers in that area, patrons, because there just was not that many people. So when you did that, this was highly offensive to somebody who was there first. But via the directive of Lord Calvert, Thomas Cressups was doing what he was supposed to. And the first conflict happened because of this. The Pennsylvania, to this point, for a couple years here, about 2 years, he had been harassing, he'd been taking land, he'd been raiding Lancaster and York. And it finally came to a headway. And there were a couple guys that got on a ferry that were from Pennsylvania, which apparently, at the end of the day, they were actually looking for the workman who was with Thomas Cressups on his ferry at Blue Rock because he had committed some kind of crime in Lancaster County. But they attacked both of them, and they were trying to drown him. And Thomas Cressups had said to the one man, "Are you trying to kill me?" To which the man replied, "Yes." And it just got very violent at that stage. And then there were complaints to Pennsylvania's government by Thomas Cressups of them trying to kill him. And ultimately, they had to come together because the volatility of the situation. Pennsylvania and Maryland colonies came to an agreement that they sort of got the line of these colonies right around where it is today, the Mason Dixon Line. And but still, hostilities would continue. So it ultimately, Parliament would have to get involved by 1737, and the conflict basically ended, the last of the hostilities, by 1738. It was quite a brutal war. They actually knew him. They hated him so much in Pennsylvania that they wound out calling him the Maryland Monster. Um, he actually, even though the 1732 agreement happened, he would still continue through to 1736 until he was eventually captured. And that was quite the debacle. And he was taken to Philadelphia, and he was renowned to say, "Damn, this is the most beautiful town in all of Maryland," saying about Philadelphia. He was an interesting guy and brutal guy. But this was just sort of Cressup's War. Eventually, King George had to get involved in 1737. There was a prisoner exchange, including Cressup's. He would never go back to Blue Rock. Once the line was sort of, the king put an end to it, it ended, and he went back to his land in Maryland. But he was absolutely hated by the people that were in there. And you have to think about it. A lot of the people that were in between that 40th and 39th parallel, They really didn't care which colony they were part of. They just didn't want to pay taxes to both. And that was sort of caused a lot of hostilities as well. And it was just a matter of how it was approached. A very aggressive style from Maryland's side, which, you know, in a lot of ways they were correct. They just didn't go about it correctly. So that was Cressip's War, and this would lead to eventually what we know as the Mason Dixon Line.
So then, therefore, you see they had this awful war, which would lead to another 25 years of basically discontent from 1738 through to 1763. And then eventually King George II had to realize there had to be finally a true resolution, and that could only happen through a true surveying of the land and putting in markers and such to define that line and force them to come to a final agreement. Let's go into that.
So ultimately, King George II would wind out having to come up with this resolution of having surveyors go out and define this line so there would no longer be this conflict. So in 1763, he hired Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. Charles Mason was a famous astronomer, and Jeremiah Dixon was a surveyor. And combined together, they had done a number of different works. It made really, really good sense to have these guys go out and do this line. So they sort of went off of partially what had been given to Pennsylvania, where it started at the very tippy top of the northernmost point of the Bay of Delaware, and sort of went down from Philadelphia, defined the line also of Delaware and its boundaries. And then they went right across 1732. They had made up with that compromise, and basically they just followed that. They would ultimately wind out putting down the stones. Cliff with Wonder and Woodsman Channel has actually done a number of stuff along the Mason Dixon Trail, and he's found a couple of these stones. There aren't many of them left, but I think they were supposed to be put every 5 miles or so. Now they have replacement stones for some of these as well, and eventually that line would wind out continuing when Virginia and Pennsylvania decided they wanted to continue that line to Pennsylvania's westernmost border. They would eventually wind out hiring somebody to go and finish that line through to the border of their what would eventually become West Virginia. But this is one of those stones there, and it's just one of those bits of history here that we look at, and you really have to say it's a lot more than what you originally thought it was. But they surveyed this from 1763 and then finished in 1767, and at that point the boundary line would become what it is today, and ultimately become what it would become for the Civil War, as that line between slave state and free, and sort of the separation between North and South. But it's a story that goes well beyond what the simple form seems to be, and really is this is why the Mason-Dixon line had to be formed, because of Cressip's Wars and a lot of misunderstandings, differences in religion and culture and all those different things. And you just wouldn't ever think about it, but there was a time that Pennsylvania and Maryland were at war, and that's the reason for the Mason-Dixon line.
So, in closing, I want to say thanks for coming along on this first journey of I didn't know that about my hometown history. We will be going into next, having to do with the Mason-Dixon line, is slavery in the North. How did that actually work? So we actually visited Fort Hunter, and they have a really cool sign, three-sided sign, that they have talking about slavery in America, slavery in Pennsylvania, and then slavery at Fort Hunter, to come to a better understanding of what actually existed. And it is one of those things that you just don't think about a whole lot, and we'll be doing that next. But it's really this Mason-Dixon line thing. It was really cool to research this, but extremely sort of hard to digest. So I hope I made that a little easier describing and explaining what actually happened. But I want to say thank you as always for coming along on another journey, and hopefully you learned something that you didn't know about your hometown history. History is out there, my friends, and we'll see you all about town.